So guys, welcome to this class. So in this class, we're going to be looking at how to register a new user using Firebase Authentication, all right? So this is where we stopped the last class, all right? We designed our login and registration pages, all right? So we're going to top it up a notch. So to dive in, the first thing that we need to do is to reference our test input layout and our button in our registration activity. All right, so you guys already know how to do that, but let's just go ahead and do it together. All right, so you have to define an instance of text input layout. So we need to resolve this and bring in Android support design. All right, so we're gonna call this full name test. This for the full name. So the next one is gonna be phone text. The other one is gonna be for our email, and the last one is gonna be for our password. Now we are done with this, we need to of course define our button as well. We call this register button. Okay, so now we are done with that, we want to actually reference the instances of these controls to the ones that we defined in our XML. All right, so I actually like keeping things pretty clean. Okay, so I'm going to define a separate method where I'll be referencing our controls. All right, so I'll say void, I'll call the method connect controls. All right, so to reference our full name test, we do this. I cast test input layout. Now say find view by ID, resource.id dot full name test. Visual Studio has actually become a lot smarter. Full test will be equal to test input layout, find view by ID, resource.id dot phone test. So the next will be email. Email test will be equal to test input layout, find view by ID, resource.id dot phone test. Sorry, email test rather. Okay, now this is done. So the next will be for password. Password test will be equal to test input layout, find view by ID, resource.id dot password test. Okay, then for register button, it will be equals to a cast of button, find view by ID, resource.id dot register button. Okay, so now that we are done with that, the next thing we need to do is to bring in the package, the Nugget package for Firebase Authentication. So to do that, we head over to our package manager and download a package and download the Nugget package for Firebase Authentication, because this is very important for us to be able to register a new user. All right. So let's search for Xamarin Firebase. And this is the one that we're looking for. So we click install to install it, accept the licenses, and this is done. So now we head back into our app. This is installed. We head back into our registration activity. All right, so what we need to do now is to bring in our Firebase authentication, to be able to register a new user, and of course bring in Firebase database where we can save some of the information that the user will be providing. All right, so let's go ahead and bring in our Firebase namespaces, all right? So using firebase.auth, using firebase.database, and of course using Firebase. So now we want to define a new instance of Firebase Authentication and Firebase Database. So to do that, we say Firebase auth, we call that mauth. And this will be the instance of our Firebase Authentication that we'll be using throughout our registration activity. So now we define a new instance of Firebase database. All right, we call that database. Okay. So now the next thing we need to do is to initialize Firebase. And if you remember, we've done this in former classes. So to speed things up, I will just go and copy the code that we use to initialize Firebase in our main activity. All right. So here is the code. So I'll just copy initialize database. And of course, we'll make some edits to it as well. All right. So we copy this. We come back here. I'll paste it here. All right. So like I said before, guys, this is a method of a different way of initializing Firebase. So let's say peradventure something didn't work so well and this didn't initialize the app. In this way, we will force Firebase to initialize. So this is very, very important and very useful as well. All right. So we are going to make some changes. Of course, we don't need this. We just delete that. Okay. So now we call this, instead of having database, we can call it initialize Firebase. All right. So when this happens, this will actually initialize our Firebase, and of course, get a reference of our database to the instance of our Firebase app. All right. So what we need to do now is to get a reference, just the way we have a reference of our database to the instance of our app. We need to do this for our authentication as well. So now that we have the method that initializes our Firebase, we need to call this method in our onCreate. All right. So we say initialize Firebase. So after initializing Firebase, we need to get an instance of our authentication. All right. So we'll now say mauth will be equal to Firebase auth dot instance. All right. So now that this is done, the next thing we need to do is, so now that we are done with this, we need to head over to our Firebase console and enable a sign-in method. All right. So we need to enable Firebase to be able to allow us to register new users with email and password. So let's go to the console and enable that. All right. So to do this, we need to go into authentication, right? So we need to set up a sign-in method, right? So we need to enable email and password because this is the one we want to use, okay? So we hit enable and save. All right. So when we've done this, we can now be able to register new users with email and password. So guys, also ensure that this is in. All right. So now let's head over back into Visual Studio and implement it. So now that we are done with this, the next thing we need to do is to create an event handler for our register button so that we can now start writing the codes that will allow us to register a new user. So to do that, we say register button.click and hit tab. All right, so a new event handler has been created for us. All right, so we want to keep this clean. So now the next thing to do, guys, will now be to start taking the values that our user will provide, from our login from our registration page. So to do that, let's define new string variables. Okay, so we define full name and phone and email and password. Okay, so now that we're done with that, we need to start taking these values from our text input. Okay, so to do that, we now say full name will be equal to full name test dot edit test dot test. Okay, so the next one will be for phone. So phone number will be equal to phone test dot edit test dot test. Okay, so the next one for email, we'll have email test dot edit test dot test. So the last one for password will be equals to password test dot edit test dot test. So in this way, we now hold the values that our users will be imputing inside these string variables. Okay, so now we won't allow users to provide any kind of values. We need it to, if it's a name, we need it to be a valid name. We need to check the validity of the phone number and the email and of course the password. So to do that, guys, let's write some if statements. Okay, so if full name, a valid name should be up to 3 characters. Okay, so let's say full name dot length is less than 3. Okay, so we need to use a snack bar to inform our users that they should enter a valid name. Okay, so to use a snack bar, we need to add a coordinator layout to our register XML. All right, so let's head into our layout design, our register layout, and add a coordinator layout. Okay, so to do that, I will change this to android.design.widget.coordinator layout. Okay, I think this should be capital C. So now instead of having orientation, okay, let's change this. Let's add an ID so that we can reference it. We'll call this root view. Okay, so we need to add this to the down part. Okay, now good. So now we need to suction the entire of our code inside a linear layout just the way it was before. All right, so let's define a linear layout. Let's add some attributes. Android orientation, the orientation should be vertical and layout height should be match parent. Layout weight should be match parent as well. Okay, so we need to copy the entire of our code into this linear layout. Okay, now everything is back to normal. So now that we have our coordinator layout, we can now use SnackBar to tell our users that the names that they provide is invalid, the email is invalid, or whatsoever. Okay, so now let's head back into our registration activity and get a reference of our coordinator layout. Okay, so just the way we did this, we just define an instance of a coordinator layout. I'll call it root view. Okay, so in our connect controls, I'll just add it here. Root view will be equal to, I always make this mistake, coordinator layout, find view by ID, resource id root view. Okay, so now we are done with this. So we'll head back into our register button, click event handler. So when the full name is less than 3, we want to say something to our user. All right, so we want to say, we want to use snackbar.make root view. I'm gonna say, please enter a valid name. All right, and we need to make it short so that it doesn't take all the time in the world. All right, snackbar.length short, now show. When that happens, we want to exit this particular method. Okay, so else if a valid phone number should be up to at least 9 characters, right? So we add that dot length. So if our length is less than 9, we do the same thing. Please enter a valid phone number. Because the drivers need to call you, right? So we need a valid phone number. Else if a valid email address should contain @ okay, so anyone that doesn't contain @ is probably an invalid email address. All right, so let's say if not mail dot contains @ we want to tell the user to provide a valid email. Okay, so the next thing we want to check is the strength of our password. Of course, a strong password should be at least up to 8 characters. Okay, so we say else if password dot length is less than 8. Okay, so we need to tell the user to please enter a password up to 8 characters. Okay, bam. Okay, so now that we are done with that, the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and start registering the user. All right, so like I always said, I like making things very explicit and clean. So I'm going to create a new method that I'm going to be using to register the user. I'm going to call this method register user. Okay, and of course I need some argument. I have to pass it a string of name, string phone, the email, and of course my password. All right, okay, good. So now to register the user, we're gonna say mauth dot create new user with email and password, right? So we're gonna pass it our email and our password. So we want to inform ourselves if the user registration is successful or failed. So we'll go ahead and add on task completion listeners, all right, which includes the success listener and failure listener, right? So let's add on success listener, all right, this and this. Okay, so and add on failure listener as well, this, pass it an activity, and of course it's asking for on failure listener. All right, this. Okay, so now to do this is an interface that we need to implement. Okay, so we need to head over to our registration activity and implement I on success listener. So we need to bring in the reference for this. Okay. So we implement the interface. So when we implement the interface, when the user registers and this is successful, whatever we put here will be executed, all right? But most of the time, I don't like handling this thing this way, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an anonymous class that will implement this interface. And this class will always be reusable from anywhere within our app. Peradventure, let's say in our login, we possibly might need, to do some complete task listeners. We might need to handle some success and failure stuffs, all right? So we'll just go ahead and reuse that particular class. All right, so I'm not going to implement this interface in this place. All right, so I'm going to remove what I have here. So guys, this most of the time might suffice within the app. Okay, it's very useful. I like doing it this way. So to do that, I'm going to create a folder and call it event listeners. Okay, I'm going to add a new folder and call it event listeners. Okay, so inside of this place, I'm going to create a new class. So this class, I'm going to call it TaskCompletion listener. Okay, so this TaskCompletion listener will fire an event that will inform us when a task was successful and when a task failed. All right, so change this to public. So if we guys remember in this interface, let me Ctrl Z. So you can see that there is an argument of Java lang object. So the task completion anonymous class that we are creating will have to inherit from this class. Okay, so to do that, we'll head into this particular class and we inherit from java.lang.object. Okay, so now we're gonna implement I on success listener. Okay, so we're gonna bring in the references. Bam. So the next thing we need to do is, of course, we got to implement the interface. So guys, is this simple and straightforward? And also we can go ahead and implement the failure listener as well. So I say I on failure listener. Okay, I have that. So I implement the interface. So now to keep things pretty clean, I will use an event. I will create an event handler, a public event handler that can always send me feedback of whether our task was successful or failed. All right, so I'm going to define a public event handler. I'm going to call my event handler success, and I'll define another one. I'm going to call this failure. All right, when our task fails, so we're going to invoke this event. All right, so it will notify our root class that the task that we are listening to has just failed. All right, so to do that, we say failure. We'll check for null, invoke this new event acts. Pretty simple and shorthand. So we can do that for success as well. So we say success dot invoke success dot invoke this new event args. Right? Okay, so now we are done. So let's go back into our registration activity and clean things up. All right, so we no longer need this, and we don't need this interface as well. So now what I'm going to do will be to now create an instance of our task completion listener. Okay, so to do that, let's come here and say task completion listener. So we're gonna bring a reference of that. We're gonna bring the reference of that. Okay, we're gonna use that, and I call this task completion listener equal to new task completion listener. Okay, so now this is where we are going to use that. All right, so inside of where I'm supposed to use the success listener, I'll use task completion listener in that place. All right, for the failure, I'll use task completion listener. All right, so to handle our callbacks when the creation of a user was successful, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say task completion listener dot success, so you guys can see the event that we created. I have this, bam. So when our task is completed and when it's successful, then anything we do here will serve as a callback. It will execute. So whenever our create user is successful, all right, so whatever code, whatever command we put here will execute. Okay, so in that same vein, let's add the same thing for failure. All right, so we have it for failure. Okay, so what do we want to do when our registration was successful? Okay, there's two things we could do. We could use SnackBar dot make root view and tell us that user registration was successful. This is short and show. Okay, so in this way we'll be informed, we'll be notified when the user's registration was successful. Okay, so let's do the same thing for failure. So what do we want to do when the registration failed? We want to inform us that the registration was, so when I said registration failed, so bam. So this is roughly what we need to do. So without much ado, let's go to our splash activity and ensure that is registration activity that starts first. Okay, obviously it's what starts first. So going forward in other classes, we will see how to, automate this so that it could always know where to start from. All right, so now that we are done with everything that is necessary, we now need to call this particular method in our button event click. So to do that, let's just go and call this method here, register user, and of course we pass our name. Of course we pass our full name, our phone, our email, and our password. Okay, this is basically all we need to provide, and we are done. So guys, the next thing we need to do is to ensure that everything checks out well. So last thing we need to do is to have a second look through our code and see if there's anything that we need to change. Okay, so we need to call this control in our onCreate method to ensure that our controls, that's our text input layout, our buttons, and all those stuff are well connected. Okay, so we're gonna call this connect control here to ensure that our controls are well referenced, and I think that's all that needs to be done. All right, so the next thing we need to do is to deploy the app and debug it and ensure that everything works perfectly. So guys, let's just run our app and see it in action. Okay, so build has started. The app is loading up. Okay, so let's see if these are caveats, the caveats that we've set is properly working. Okay. Okay, please enter a valid name, your Phoenix. So let's put a phone number. Okay. Let's make it invalid intentionally. Please enter a valid phone number. So this works so well. So let's input our email address. Okay, so guys, as you can see, this works just very well. Okay, so let's just go ahead and test our registration and ensure that everything checks out well. Okay, so let's click on register. So bam, user registration was successful. So guys, to confirm that, we have to head into we have to head over to Firebase, of course. We'll refresh our authentication, and you can see, guys, Phoenix Academy has been registered. Okay, so guys, this is just how to register a new user with Firebase Authentication. So now we need the information of the user in our database. Okay, we need the information here so that we can always access it. We just registered the user, but we need some of the information here. All right, so in our next class, guys, we'll be looking at how to save our data to Firebase using HashMap. Okay, so guys, see you in the next class.